January 2012, I joined the Human Rights Council branch. So it's like basically the supporting of the Human Rights Council is a pretty administrative post, to be honest, not much substance there.
Yes.
And they were doing a reorganisation at the end of 2012 that would come into effect at the beginning of 2013. So I volunteered. I said I wanted to do the NGO post because the way we were dealing with NGOs wasn't great. Like the way they were talked about was kind of as a problem to the running of the council rather than as sort of equal participants.
Yeah.
And I thought, I could probably make some difference there. And basically the first thing I was asked to do was to respond to a message from the Chinese delegation where they gave a list of people and said, are any of these people planning to come to the council?
Right.
Now, I'm aware that in the September session the previous year, we had a similar request from Turkey. Okay. People they accused of being members of the PKK. Okay. And the answer had been, nope, that information is confidential. It's not released publicly. It's against the rules to release it to an individual member state. We're not telling you. Yeah. But for China, that was not what we were told to do. So basically, there was all these emails exchanged at that time, debating whether or not these names would be handed over. And I discovered afterwards that all of those emails seemed to have been entirely for my benefit because names were already being handed over to China and had been for years, from what I can gather. Basically, from that point onwards, I didn't manage to stop it in 2013. Like, I went to the High Commissioner, I went to the UN's internal sort of investigations service. Yeah. I reported it through all of the means I had available to me, and still they ended up handing over names on the 1st of March 2013. It was someone else that sent out those emails. I was then just incredibly forgetful and incompetent, according to the Chinese government, and kind of just forgot to send confirmations. But at the end of 2013, I was leaving that post and moving to another part of OHHR on a temporary contract because my boss basically had been harassing me because I'd reported him for wrongdoing because of handing over these names. And so at that point, I just thought, right, nothing else is working. I'll go and report it to the member states. So I reported it to the EU, and they were shocked. And I gave the person from the EU delegation the proof. So, like, they had emails in which names were unambiguously handed to a Chinese delegate at a time, when nobody knew who was going to be coming to the council, when they could intimidate their family members. Like, I gave them the proof. And they called in the guy who was responsible for this, guy called Eric Tistune.
Who was that?
His name is Eric Tistune. And he apparently gave a great act. So I had left that branch, handed the proof to the EU, a delegation of very powerful member states, thinking, right, they'll sort it and stop it happening again. But they called in this guy, and like I said, he's a French national, and he just lied. And apparently the EU, despite having evidence this was indeed happening, did nothing. I discovered that it was still happening, but my post remained in the Human Rights Council branch technically, and I kept getting all these temporary posts elsewhere because I did not want to go back there. And when I was due to be going back once, I was put back on the email lists of that branch, and I realised this was still happening. So then I went to the Irish delegation directly because I have dual citizenship, and Ireland, within the EU, they kind of split tasks up, and Ireland is technically responsible for human rights defenders. So I thought, right, great. I'm Irish, Ireland's responsible for this, I'll go tell the Irish. And they were aware of it, obviously, because they'd been at the meeting of the EU. Yeah. But they apparently hadn't seen the evidence. So when I'd given that to the EU delegation, they hadn't shared it with all the member states. All the member states didn't, in fact, realise that this was something that was really going on. And the UN has been at pains to present it as some kind of disgruntled employee situation rather than a serious human rights issue. So they'd been told basically that I was I don't know, banshee or whatever. I mean, quite why I would still be employed at the UN, which I still am 7 years after reporting this. If I were lying is another matter. And yes, I went to them, and I know that the then ambassador did go, and she raised it at the Bureau of the Human Rights Council. That's where the everyday running of the Human Rights Council is done by the president and then ambassadors of 4 different member states from 4 different like the different regions as recognised by the UN. And she raised it there and said, this must stop. Now, I have no idea whether that worked. She doesn't either. Because the UN's approach to this has been, any time they are asked publicly about it, to lie. Yeah. And what's really interesting, though, is that they've now got themselves into something of a bind, because there's no forum in which I can sue the UN for complicity in torture, which is what I would really like to do. Because everybody has diplomatic immunity, including me. So everyone that works at the UN has diplomatic immunity. You can't sue the individuals, and you can't sue the UN because it has diplomatic immunity. So the only possible forum in which I can sort of even raise this issue is basically an internal employment tribunal within the UN. So I had 3 cases. It's very difficult to get a case because in order to take this to the employment tribunal, I have to show that it's my contract. Not that they've endangered a human rights defender and caused the torture of their family members, but that my individual employment contract has been breached in some way. So I managed to find 3 different breaches over the years, and I got all of that to court, and it was finally heard last year. So that's actually exactly 1 year since I testified in court. I was the only person that noticed that we would be doing that on the anniversary of Shannon, and I figured it would probably be to my advantage, in a sense, to have lots of newspaper articles that morning explaining what China does to human rights defenders. And it went really well. Nobody that sat in those hearings thought for a second that I would not win. The judge published one judgment in which he explicitly found the Secretary General, and not, they always refer to the Secretary General kind of, because they're referring to the organisation. This one had actually meant the man himself. The Secretary General had decided not to apply UN policy in my case, basically to cover this up. And then the judge found himself without a job before he could finish his other 2 judgments. They literally got rid of a judge at 24 hours notice. My cases were passed to the judge who was involved in his removal, and they languish in front of her now. She has failed to publish any of the orders in my case, which is against the rules. They're meant to be public documents. Happy to share those if you want them. And she's now moved my case behind closed doors. So we had a closed door hearing last week, at which basically she wants to call lots of witnesses to talk about my personality effectively, like as if somehow the fact that people that I reported for wrongdoing didn't like me afterwards provides post facto justification for complicity in torture. I don't quite get the argument, but that's the direction that she's clearly going with it. So yeah, basically in court and in documents, like I have 7 years of written evidence of this. In written documents, the UN's actual position about this is, yes, names were handed to China, but it was unreasonable of me as a human rights officer at the UN to believe that the principles of do no harm, of confidentiality, of the personal information of human rights defenders, and of the independence of the international civil service, so applying the same rule to China as every other member state, could under any circumstances trump the mere possibility of a better working relationship between the UN Human Rights Office and China, and they literally put that in writing. That is the position of the UN's ethics bodies. Right. The UN's position in court is that it is unreasonable of me to try to reopen this issue because it has been looked at by 3 separate ethics officers and they all came to that conclusion. My position is, here are witness statements from the people whose names were handed over saying that their family members were tortured. And yeah, it's like, it's this surreal thing. But every time the UN is asked about it by a journalist or in public, they say that it never happened. Complete opposite of all the written documents. That I'm somehow... There's usually quite a lot of personal insults about me, which is par for the course. It's how they deal with whistleblowers. The guy who handed over the names, I mean, why would you do that? Like, even the emails from the Chinese asking for this referred explicitly to a favor. There was no question that China thought this was information that should be handed over within the rules. This was a favor that they wanted done for them. So yeah, I mean, I would imagine that the person who took the decision to do it, I think, and again, it's entirely speculation. I imagine that's a degree of sort of compromise by China and whatever else. Yeah. The people who covered it up afterwards I think that that's just a sort of almost a reflexive cover-up. You know what I mean? Yes. I don't actually think, because when this sort of first came out, someone in the ethics office actually leaked a very technical document. I mean, I was accused by the UN of being the source of that leak, which is kind of ridiculous. Frankly, if I was going to leak something, I'd leak the emails of which names were handed to China. It's much easier to understand those. But after that, the UN put out this quite extraordinary sort of press release, basically painting me as some kind of insane person. It's one of the things we're actually in court over because they lied about me in it. And their position on that is that the UN has a right to lie about staff members to the press and to member states in order to protect its reputation. That's part of their legal position. Millions have been spent by the UN covering this up. Like literally millions. And, you know, sorry, but my cases are quite complex. Having all those hearings for days and then getting rid of the judge, like how much do you reckon that's costing them? But yeah, I mean, basically, I think for the rest of the people, they were lied to. I know that for a fact, that internally, when I reported this, he did the same as he did to the EU. He basically said that I was a liar, I was making it up, I was a fantasist, whatever the hell else. And I think that once they'd put out that press release, it's like the UN. The best analogy I can come up with is like, it's like when Sinead O'Connor tore up the picture of the Pope. You know what I mean? It took a long time for people to realise that sex abuse was really happening. And it was like, you can't criticise the Catholic Church. It's seen as you can't criticise the UN. It's somehow, if you criticise the things that are legitimate to criticise about the UN, it's somehow you're allying yourself with sort of the far right who want the UN not to exist. I think the UN deeply needs to exist. I also think it deeply needs to not put the people it's supposed to be protecting in actual danger. You know, and it's kind of like the other scandals that have rocked the UN in recent years have been genuine sort of bad apple situations. Like, you know, nobody thinks it is UN policy to rape children. It is UN policy to put human rights defenders in danger, but at China's request. Now, that shouldn't be UN policy. And it's also like, and I think it's one of the things that sort of people always think it's very esoteric because nobody understands kind of the internal workings of the UN. So the member states are conflated with the administration. And the interesting thing here is that the member states had clear rules about this. The member states set rules where you cannot give this information. There are written rules saying that if a member state wants to know who's coming to the Human Rights Council, they have to ask that in front of all the other member states and collectively decide whether or not the Secretariat, i.e. the administration part, should hand over that information. That wasn't done here. This was the Secretariat deciding to break the rules set by member states. And when I pointed that out to the sort of ethics mechanisms, their response was that it is not misconduct in the UN for a UN staff member to breach rules set by member states. It's only misconduct if they breach the staff rules, which is extraordinary. I mean, like you said, it's taxpayers' money. The members set the rules. That's the entire basis of this organisation. But and I have a tape of her telling me that, the head of ethics. It's now reached that level where there's no independence of the judiciary at all within the system. The judge that was removed from my case had been very critical of the lack of independence of the judiciary. Basically, the Secretary General is the respondent in my case, and he got rid of the judge to hand the case to a judge he liked better. So the first judge's ruling, I'm going to hint very strongly at something that I would be breaching rules if I told you directly. The first ruling gave the UN 30 days in which to decide whether or not to place the former High Commissioner for Human Rights under investigation for lying about me in a press release. The UN did not appeal that decision. The Secretary General, in a public meeting in December 2019, when asked specifically about my case, he did two things. First of all, he revealed that there is an investigation ongoing. Now, anyone there could put two and two together and come to the correct conclusion. And secondly, he claimed falsely that I have been protected. That's not true. I've been transferred to a cupboard, basically. You know what I mean? My speciality is rule of law, torture, blah, blah, blah. So they put me working on economics. Yeah, I mean, basically, I opposed the removal of the judge. And the UN Appeals Tribunal came back and said that my complaint wasn't receivable because the General Assembly had decided to remove the judge. That's complete crap. I mean, honestly, the General Assembly just gasped it through. The General Assembly were like, yeah, let's have new half-time judges. Okay, let's vote for them. Nobody told the General Assembly that that meant that the judge that was currently there was going to be removed at 24 hours notice in a big whistleblower case. You know, these judges only deal with cases where it's like someone was fired for misconduct, but it's usually like, or didn't get a promotion that they wanted, or that kind of thing. They do not deal with cases where it's like the UN's actively endangering human rights defenders. And the judge in my case, the original one, said from the bench that he had never seen a case like this before. He had never seen a case where the Secretary General was directly involved, which makes things difficult because it's like, yeah, who investigates the actions of the Secretary General, given that everyone reports to him? Yeah. And, you know, he's been more involved recently as well. You know, I've had direct contact with him, and I met with him in February. Right. And he basically admitted to me in a meeting that was witnessed by Miranda Brown. He admitted to me that he basically knew that what I was saying was true, that I had been subjected to retaliation by the former High Commissioner and that was ongoing because the people retaliating were still there. And the new High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, has basically ignored all of my communications and requests to meet since she took office. And he basically said that it was politically difficult to resolve my case because the former High Commissioner has been critical of him in the press. And ironically, the former High Commissioner, who did nothing about my reports that names were being handed to China, has been criticizing him for failing to speak up about the Uyghurs. I'm like, and what about the at least 7 Uyghur names that were handed over under your watch, where those people's families were then put in the camps? The hypocrisy here is astounding. Lots of different people, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, people that were in Tiananmen, and anyone that was just basically anyone that China didn't want to be there. So like I said, there's actually, I can't, you know what I mean? I'm not going to place anyone in danger by revealing any names that are on the list that nobody else knows. Two of the names that are now public, because both of them have come out in support of me, are Dulcan Issa. He's the head of the World Uyghur Congress. He gave witness testimony in my case that the Chinese would send the police to his family home and force his family members to phone him, often on a phone number that he hadn't given them for their own safety, and beg him not to come and not to conduct advocacy. His parents were both, his brother was arbitrarily arrested and disappeared. His parents were both among the first people in these camps and both have died there. Right. Now, obviously, it's difficult to make direct lines between the moment when the UN handed over his name because he didn't know that was happening. Okay. So he doesn't have the sort of the timeline of did this exactly after this. You know, how else did the Chinese police know that he was planning to go to the Human Rights Council? If not, they were being told. The other one is Gang Hui. I'm very bad at pronouncing her name. She's the wife of Gao Shisheng. At the time her name was handed over, the Working Group in Arbitrary Detention was sending letters to China asking where he was. He's like the big human rights lawyer. Yeah. So the UN's independent human rights mechanisms writing to China saying, where is this man? And at the same time, you've got the administration of the UN, without the knowledge of any member states or any of these experts, telling China, yeah, his wife's going to turn up. Now, he managed to get out a book about his torture in detention, and there are parts of that where he talks about torture with the specific purpose of him telling people not to participate in advocacy. Right. Now, I would be prepared to make a large bet as to what that might be about. Yeah. And it's just, I mean, this is the opposite of what we're supposed to do. Like, this is, and everyone involved in this, everyone who just went along with this has been promoted in the UN. They're all still there. They're all still in NGOs. They're now in charge of NGOs in some cases, like they're in charge of sort of all of this stuff. So the post that I used to occupy where I saw this happening and reported it is now occupied by someone who saw it happening and did nothing. The guy who ordered this is still in post In fact, he just published a book at UN expense about the Human Rights Council with a nice little foreword by the High Commissioner. I mean, this is just unbelievable.
Yes, yeah.
The UN's legal argument would fall apart if this isn't still happening. And that's the thing, the only place that they've ever told the truth about the fact that, yes, names are handed over is in court. And in court, they argue it's ongoing. Because if they were to say in court, we stopped doing this, that would completely undermine their argument, because their argument is, I have no reason to believe this is a problem, and I have no reason to make these reports, and I'm an unreasonable person and just a bad staff member, because why wouldn't I listen to my superiors? That's their entire argument. That argument falls apart if they stopped. If my reports led to this stopping, the entire legal argument of the UN in my case falls to pieces, because then I was right to report it if it stopped. Yeah. I mean, there's sort of a lot of attention being paid at the minute to sort of China getting its own nationals into agencies. And, you know, there's a lot of this sort of like of the 15 independent agencies, 4 are currently run by Chinese nationals and stuff. But in a sense, for me, that misses the point. If China already has the administration willing to do what it tells them against the rules, it doesn't need to install nationals. But nobody has ever investigated the handing of names to China. I have been demanding for 7 years that either the UN's internal investigation service do it, or that member states call for an external investigation. And there has been no action. The UN is seen almost as like the beacon on the hill kind of thing. It's seen by people as like the last great hope. It's the one remaining hope when everything else has gone wrong. And especially UN human rights mechanisms, like by definition, for a lot of them, you have to exhaust internal mechanisms, national mechanisms anyway. So it's like, this is your last hope that sort of principles matter, that human rights actually exist. And I know for the Uyghurs and for others, like that was why, I mean, that's why it's just so wrong. It's like, these people are, like you said, often they know the risks they're taking to a degree. But what they don't expect is that this last mechanism in which they're placing all of their hope is going to betray them. And do it behind their backs, without their consent, without even telling them that their names have been handed over so they can warn people. You know, it's just so despicable. And so much the opposite of what we need to be doing. But yeah, and that's the thing, I'm watching what's happening in Hong Kong. I mean, I used to live there for 3 years. And it's just, you see the hope that people have in this system. And you know what they're doing within the system, and you know that when they're asked about it, they will lie, and that they assert a right to lie about it. So, you know, you see these kind of press releases coming out, and there's often a sort of confusion. Like, if it's from a special rapporteur, it's from that individual. It's not from sort of the UN as such, and they're often much braver and say things that, frankly, I wish HR would say. And then you get the ones kind of from the High Commissioner, you know, expressing concern about protests or whatever. And, you know, if they're so concerned about these protests, could they maybe not be handing over names of family members? Like the names of the people who are planning to come and talk about it. There's no external oversight of anything in the UN. None. Nobody has the power to go in and, like, actually investigate stuff. The UN... the entire system is set up that the UN appoints its own investigators. Even the court system, if you actually look at how it's structured, I have a complaint about the removal of the judge. He was removed at the instigation of the executive director of the Office of Administration of Justice. The registrar, who is responsible for sort of handling all the documentation in my case, for deciding how it's going to be handled, that kind of stuff, and the running of the court, reports directly to her. The only free access to legal assistance that I have is a sort of an internal office of the UN that has lawyers. My lawyer reports directly to her. So I've said to the tribunal, right, on this issue, I want to represent myself because my lawyer has a conflict of interest that anyone with a brain can blatantly see. So because I dared to file a document myself saying that the judge in my case is a conflict of interest because the other judge will be coming to testify that she was instrumental in his removal, you know, again, pretty clear conflict of interest for anyone that follows these things. They objected to me filing that document on my own behalf and removed my access to all the documents in my own court case. The UK, the person whose name was handed over, has, as far as I'm aware, never set foot in China. It was a UK citizen. As far as I'm aware, he's never been to China. He just worked for an NGO that spoke about China. And China and the UN gave the name of a UK citizen to the Chinese government without informing the person, without informing the UK, without informing anybody.